I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. I always thought my grandfather's quiet was just the way age settles into a person, like dust on a windowsill you stop noticing. He lived with us the last 5 years of his life, moving softly through the house, taking his tea without sugar, nodding instead of speaking whenever conversation grew too crowded. We called him Pop, and he smiled at that, a small, private smile that never asked for attention. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who fixed the loose hinge without being asked, who folded his napkin after every meal. If he had memories, they stayed behind his eyes. If he had wounds, they healed in places no one could see. He died on a rainy Tuesday in early spring. No drama, no last words, just a long exhale and a stillness that filled the room like a held breath finally released. We grieved the way families do, food, visitors, stories told softly and repeatedly until they lost their edges. People said he'd lived a good, long life, 91 years. A veteran, they added with a respectful nod. World War II, infantry, Europe. That was all we ever knew. That was all he ever gave. Weeks later, when the house felt too big and too quiet, I volunteered to help my mother clean out his old room. It smelled faintly of camphor and paper. His dresser drawers held neatly folded socks and letters from the electric company, saved for reasons no one understood. Under the bed, we found a tin of buttons and a pair of boots polished to a dull shine. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that suggested a story waiting to be told. Then my foot caught on a loose floorboard near the window. It lifted more easily than it should have, like it had been waiting. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into the dark, was a small leather diary, cracked with age, its strap brittle but intact. My name was not on it, no name was, just a faint embossing on the cover, initials worn smooth by time. I held it like a fragile thing, unsure whether I had the right to open it at all. My mother hesitated. "He never liked people poking around his things," she said, not unkindly. "I know," I replied, "but he hid this." That was the first time it occurred to me that my grandfather had secrets. The diary smelled like old libraries and something metallic like coins. The pages were thin, yellowed, filled with a careful, slanted handwriting that felt both patient and urgent. The first entry was dated June 1944. The second line stopped me cold. It didn't begin with fear or patriotism or any of the words I expected from a soldier's account. It began with regret. He wrote, "I have learned that silence can be a shield, but it can also be a prison." I sat on the edge of the bed, rain tapping the window, and began to read. He wrote about leaving home at 19, about a mother who pressed a handkerchief in his palm and told him not to be brave, just to be alive. He wrote about the ocean crossing, the smell of oil and sweat, the way the horizon looked endless and unforgiving. He wrote sparingly about combat, never lingering, never naming places when he could avoid it. But there was a rhythm to his words, a careful pacing, as if he were choosing each sentence the way one chooses a step across thin ice. Then, 3 entries in, everything changed. He wrote, "We were overrun. Orders came and dissolved in the noise. I followed a man whose name I never learned, and then he was gone." I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't the story we'd been told at the funeral, the tidy version of service and survival. This was confusion, fear, disappearance. He wrote about capture, though he didn't use that word. He wrote about being herded, about hunger that made time feel slippery, about faces that blurred together in memory because remembering them hurt too much. He wrote about a camp whose name he never recorded, only its sounds, the whistle, the counting, the nights that never fully slept. What struck me most was how often he returned to small details: a chipped mug, a tune hummed by a guard, the way frost crept along the inside of a window. He avoided grand statements, he avoided blame. It was as if he were determined to tell the truth without turning it into spectacle. Days passed as I read in stolen hours, the diary heavy in my hands. My mother asked questions I couldn't answer yet. "Was he scared?" she asked once. "Yes," I said, because the diary made that unmistakably clear, but not the way we imagine. Then I reached the entry dated November 12, 1944. "I have made a decision. If I do not write again, let it be known that I chose this." The next pages described a plan so quiet, so precise, it felt like watching someone dismantle a lock with bare fingers. He wrote about observing patterns, about noticing which fence sat. I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. I read the next entry slowly, like stepping into cold water 1 inch at a time. My grandfather's handwriting tightened after that November night, the letters closer together and the margins narrower, as if space itself had become something precious. He described the escape not as a burst of movement, but as a long, careful shrinking of the world. The fence did not fall. It yielded, a wire loosened weeks earlier by numb fingers, bent back only enough for 2 bodies to slip through, coats snagging, breath held until lungs burned. He wrote about the mud swallowing boots, about crawling because standing felt too loud, too proud. He wrote about the man with him, Elias, finally a name, who pressed his forehead into the earth and whispered a prayer in a language my grandfather did not understand. They did not run, they disappeared by becoming smaller than the night. They moved by counting steps and listening for the wind to cover their mistakes. He described the cold as a living thing that found every opening, every doubt. When they reached the tree line, he wrote, he realized he had not thought beyond that moment. Freedom, he learned, was not a destination. It was a series of decisions that never stopped asking for payment. They walked until their legs shook, then hid until the sky paled, then walked again. Food was a rumor. Water was a risk. Every sound felt like a verdict. What struck me was how often he wrote about restraint. Elias wanted to take a road at dawn. My grandfather refused. Roads remembered feet. Roads betrayed. They chose ditches and hedges, places no one loved enough to watch closely. When Elias stumbled and cursed, my grandfather waited until the birds resumed their noise before moving again. He wrote about the math of survival, how it demanded subtraction, less light, less noise, less self. The heroics were in what they did not do. Days blurred. He stopped dating entries and marked time by churches and rivers, a farmer's barn where they slept in the rafters, counting breaths as footsteps passed below, a loaf of bread left on a windowsill by a woman who never looked up. He wrote her kindness without embroidery, as if praising it too loudly might put her at risk even decades later. There was a moment when Elias wanted to split up, convinced that together they were more visible. My grandfather wrote that he had never felt more afraid than at the thought of being alone with his thoughts. They stayed together. Then came the choice that made me set the diary down and press my palms into my eyes. They were near a border. He did not name it, only described a river that ran fast and dark, and they were being followed. He wrote about the sound first, the wrongness of it, a cadence that did not belong to animals. They hid beneath brush as voices passed close enough to smell tobacco. Elias whispered that he could not cross the river. He could not swim. The current would take him. He begged my grandfather to go on, to carry the story forward. My grandfather wrote that he argued, then pleaded, then listened to the river argue back. The diary's ink bled there as if the pen had lingered too long. "I stayed," he wrote. "I do not know if that makes me loyal or foolish. I know only that leaving felt like dying twice." They crossed together, not cleanly, not bravely. He wrote about the water stealing heat and strength, about hands slipping, about a moment when he thought Elias was gone and screamed into the current without sound. They reached the far bank and lay shaken, the sky spinning. He wrote nothing triumphant. He wrote about vomiting river water and laughing at the wrongness of being alive. After that, the entries thinned. He wrote about contact with people who spoke in half sentences and gestures, about being hidden in a cellar that smelled of apples and rot, about learning to be still again, a different stillness than the camp, one that tasted like patience instead of despair. He wrote about papers that were not his and names that did not fit his mouth. He wrote about waiting for a signal that came as a knock with the wrong rhythm. When the diary resumed its dates, it was spring. He had crossed another line, another river, another fear. He wrote about uniforms again, friendly this time, though he noted that friendliness was a skill learned under pressure. He wrote about reporting in, about being asked questions he answered carefully, truth wrapped in context so it could be received. He wrote about Elias being separated from him, sent elsewhere to recover. There was a sentence that sat alone on a page. "I never saw him again." I closed the diary then, not because I was finished, but because I needed to breathe. My mother watched me from the doorway, reading my face the way parents do when they know something important is happening. "He escaped?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but that's not the whole thing." That night I dreamed of rivers. In the days that followed, I learned how the escape braided itself into the rest of his life. The diary did not become celebratory, it became quieter. He wrote about coming home, about a mother older than he remembered, about learning how to sleep in a bed without counting footsteps. He wrote about choosing a job that required patience, about falling in love with my grandmother because she asked questions and did not rush his answers. He wrote about teaching himself not to flinch when doors slammed. He wrote about silence as a practice, not an absence. Some stories, he wrote, are better honored by being lived instead of told. I thought of all the times we'd asked him about the war, the way he'd smiled and changed the subject, offered us more potatoes. It hadn't been forgetfulness, it had been curation. He had protected us from the parts that could not be handed down without harm. He had given us steadiness instead. The final pages before the last section were practical. Lists, addresses, a pressed leaf taped into the back. And then, near the end, a return to regret, not of the escape, but of what it cost him afterward. He wrote about friends who wanted stories and the way their eyes changed when he offered none. He wrote about Elias, about imagining him alive somewhere, telling a different version or none at all. Survival, he wrote, creates a debt you can never fully repay. You learn to live by paying interest in kindness. When I finished part 2 of the diary, I understood my grandfather's quiet as a form of ethics. He had chosen to live in a way that did not ask the world to applaud him. He had chosen to be useful, attentive, gentle. He had chosen to keep the most dramatic night of his life from becoming the loudest thing about him. And in doing so, he had shaped a family that mistook calm for simplicity, humility for emptiness. I placed the diary back into its oilcloth, not to hide it again, but to honor the care with which it had been kept. There were still pages left, a final section marked by a different tone, a different urgency. I sensed what remained would ask something of me, not just as a reader, but as a keeper of his truth. The question was no longer whether the story should be told. I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. The final section of the diary did not begin with a date. It began with a sentence written in a steadier hand than the pages before it, as if my grandfather had waited years, decades even, before allowing himself to write it down. This part, he wrote, is not about escape. It is about what follows you home. I felt a tightening in my chest as I read on, because I understood instinctively that this was the heart of it, not the fences or the rivers or the night that proved he could outrun death, but the long, ordinary years afterward, where survival had to learn how to coexist with peace. He wrote about returning to a country that wanted heroes and parades, when all he wanted was a chair in the shade. He wrote about neighbors who shook his hand too hard, about questions that came wrapped in pride but landed like demands. "Tell us," they said, "tell us how it was." He wrote that he learned to answer with weather and rations, with jokes about boots and bad coffee, anything that kept the real story intact. He described the first time a car backfired near the grocery store, and he found himself on the ground, hands over his head, heart racing as strangers stared. He laughed it off later, told everyone he'd slipped. In the diary, he did not laugh. He wrote about shame, about the fear of being seen as broken when he had worked so hard simply to be alive. He wrote about choosing silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because words, once released, could not be gathered back up. There was a passage about my grandmother that made my throat ache. He wrote about meeting her at a church social, about the way she listened with her whole body, as if the world mattered when you spoke. He wrote that he told her, early on, that there were things he could not share. She did not demand them, he wrote. She made room for them. When he woke in the night, shaking, she did not ask for explanations. She put a hand on his back and breathed with him until the present returned. He wrote that love, to him, became an agreement to live forward without forcing the past to perform. As I read, moments from my childhood rearranged themselves. The way he always sat facing the door, the way he disliked fireworks but never complained, the way he insisted on fixing things himself as if dependence were a luxury he could not quite trust. These were not quirks, they were adaptations, skills learned in extremity and repurposed for peace. Near the end, the diary returned to Elias. My grandfather wrote that he searched for him after the war, through letters and lists and quiet inquiries that went nowhere. He wrote that he learned to live with unanswered questions, to accept that some debts remain open. If Elias survived, he wrote, I hope he found a way to sleep. It was the only wish he allowed himself on the page. The final entry was short. I am an old man now, he wrote. My hands are steady again. I have lived a life that looks small from the outside and feels large from within. If this diary is ever found, let it teach gentleness. Loud courage has its place. Quiet courage keeps the world turning. I closed the diary and held it to my chest, feeling the weight of years settle into me. My grandfather had not wanted a monument, he had wanted continuity. He had wanted his escape to mean something beyond survival, to become a way of living that valued patience, restraint, and care. In that sense, he had escaped every day of his life, choosing not to be imprisoned by the worst night he'd known. I told my mother everything, slowly, carefully, choosing words he had taught me without teaching me at all. She cried, not from shock, but from recognition. That sounds like him, she said. And it did. It sounded like the man who fixed hinges and folded napkins, who listened more than he spoke, who made space for others to feel safe. In the weeks that followed, I faced a choice of my own. The story felt too important to stay hidden, yet too intimate to be exploited. I decided to tell it the way he lived it, without spectacle, without noise, with respect for the silences that mattered. I shared it with family first, then with a small group of listeners who understood that bravery does not always announce itself. The diary now rests where it belongs, not under a floorboard, but in a place of honor. I return to it when the world feels too loud, when courage is confused with volume. My grandfather taught me, across time and paper, that the truest escapes are not always from places, but from the versions of ourselves that fear demands. He escaped once under wire and moonlight. He escaped again and again by choosing kindness over bitterness, listening over speaking, dignity over display. And in telling his story, I realized that some silences are not meant to be broken loudly. They are meant to be carried forward, carefully, like a flame passed hand to hand, lighting the way without burning what it touches. I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. After the diary was no longer a secret between the floorboards and me, the world seemed to rearrange itself around its truth. I noticed how often I measured my days by noise, notifications, arguments, the constant demand to be seen, and how foreign my grandfather's chosen quiet felt by comparison. Carrying his story changed the way I listened. It made me patient in rooms where impatience usually won. It made me aware that history does not always roar. Sometimes it hums low enough that only those willing to slow down can hear it. I began researching the fragments he'd left behind, not to verify him, his words had already done that, but to understand the shape of the world he'd moved through. Maps spread across my kitchen table, rivers traced in blue that matched his descriptions, church names that lined up with the towns he mentioned only by their bells. I learned how borders shifted under pressure, how names changed when the war ended, how survival stories fell through the cracks when they did not fit a clean narrative. I learned that camps like the one he never named existed in places that wanted to forget them. I learned that escape routes were often built from kindness more than courage, from people who never expected to be remembered. The more I learned, the more I understood why he wrote the way he did. Precision mattered, restraint mattered. He had told the truth without inflating it, had trusted the reader to feel the weight without being told where to place it. That trust felt like a responsibility. I began to think about Elias not as a supporting character, but as a person whose life intersected my family's fate for a handful of nights and then disappeared into the wide, indifferent years. I wondered who mourned him, who remembered him sitting at a table facing the door, who noticed his quiet and mistook it for nothing. One afternoon, sorting through public records, I found a name that made my breath catch. It wasn't proof, it was a possibility. A man with the right age, the right origin, a note about displacement and resettlement. I did not pursue it further. The diary had taught me that some doors are better knocked on gently, if at all. Hope can be a gift or a trespass. I let Elias remain as my grandfather had held him, in respect, not possession. Sharing the story beyond our family took time. When I finally did, I kept my grandfather's cadence, his refusal to dramatize. I told listeners about wire and water, yes, but I lingered on the waiting, the noticing, the choices that looked small and saved lives. The responses surprised me. People wrote about their own quiet elders, about drawers they'd never opened, about silences they suddenly wanted to understand instead of fill. The story did not demand applause, it invited attention. As weeks passed, I felt the moral of it settle into me, not as a lesson preached, but as a posture adopted. Courage did not have to announce itself. Survival did not entitle you to dominate a room. The bravest thing my grandfather had done after escaping was to build a life that made room for others, to keep his sharpest memories from cutting the people he loved. He had chosen dignity over display, steadiness over spectacle. I began to see how often we mistake loudness for importance, exposure for honesty. My grandfather's diary argued otherwise. It suggested that truth can be carried quietly without losing its force, that restraint can be an ethical choice. He had lived in a way that asked nothing from the world except the chance to contribute, and the world, in return, had received a man who fixed hinges, folded napkins, and made a home feel safe. On the anniversary of his death, we gathered again, smaller this time, more intentional. I read a passage from the diary aloud, choosing one without fences or rivers. My mother closed her eyes. My children listened, still enough to surprise me. When I finished, there was no rush to speak. The silence felt earned. It felt like him. Later that night, alone, I returned the diary to its place and understood something that had eluded me before. The daring escape was not the most important part of his story. It was the proof that he could choose his life. The rest of his years were the practice of that choice. Every day he opted for patience, for kindness, for a humility that did not diminish him, but refined him. He escaped fear by refusing to let it decide who he would become. I closed the book and felt gratitude without spectacle, not the kind that demands expression, but the kind that steadies your hands, the kind that teaches you how to live forward with care. My grandfather's quiet was no longer a mystery, it was a gift, and carrying it felt less like telling a story and more like keeping a promise to let courage be gentle, to let truth breathe, and to remember that sometimes the bravest lives are the ones that never asked to be watched. I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. As time went on, the diary stopped feeling like an artifact and started feeling like a companion, not in a haunting way, but in the way certain books sit beside you while you live, quietly influencing your decisions without asking for credit. I noticed how often my grandfather's words surfaced when I faced choices that felt smaller than his but carried the same moral texture. Moments where speaking would be easier than listening, moments where being right would cost more than being kind, moments where fear watched, waiting to see what I would do. There was one afternoon in particular that brought his lesson sharply into focus. I was standing in line at a government office, the kind where frustration hangs in the air like stale breath. A man ahead of me began to raise his voice, his anger spilling outward, demanding attention. I felt the familiar urge to withdraw, to become invisible, a habit I'd learned growing up around my grandfather's quiet. But then I remembered the diary's insistence that restraint was not avoidance, it was intention. I stepped forward, spoke calmly, redirected the moment. The room softened. The conflict dissolved. Later, walking back to my car, I realized I had acted with a courage that made no noise. I smiled, thinking of him. I also began to understand the cost of carrying stories responsibly. People wanted details, drama, the cinematic version of his escape. They asked about guards and guns, about narrow misses and daring leaps. I gave them enough to understand the stakes, but not enough to turn his life into entertainment. I remembered his line about stories being better honored by being lived instead of told. The restraint was not censorship, it was care. It kept the story human. In my research, I discovered how many escapes never made it into official histories because they did not fit the language of victory. They were messy, dependent on strangers, shaped by luck as much as courage. My grandfather's diary belonged to that quiet majority. He had never wanted to stand out. He had wanted to survive without becoming hardened by survival. That, I realized, was the daring part most people missed. One evening, as I read the diary again, I noticed something I'd overlooked before. In the margins of several entries, there were small marks, dots, tiny lines, notations I'd assumed were accidental. Laying the pages side by side, I saw the pattern. They marked moments of help. A loaf of bread, a door left unlocked, a whispered direction. He had counted kindness the way others counted miles. He had escaped not alone, but carried by a network of quiet decency. It reframed the story entirely. His survival was not a solo act, it was a chorus that never took the stage. This realization changed how I spoke about the war to my children. I stopped focusing on battles and dates and began talking about choices made in kitchens and fields by people whose names history forgot. I told them about the woman who left bread on a windowsill and never looked up. I told them about the farmer who did not ask questions. I told them about Elias, whose courage included admitting fear. I wanted my children to understand that goodness often wears plain clothes. As months passed, the story found its way into unexpected places. A listener wrote to tell me she'd opened her own grandmother's trunk for the first time. Another said he stopped pressing his father for stories he wasn't ready to tell. The diary had become a bridge, not a monument. It connected people through respect rather than revelation. I felt my grandfather's presence, not as a voice, but as a standard. There were nights, though, when the weight of it all pressed harder, when I wondered whether keeping parts of the story quiet was a form of erasure, when I questioned whether my grandfather's restraint had cost him connection. I returned to his final pages then, to his assertion that he had lived a life that felt large from within. That was the measure he had chosen. It was not my place to revise it. On a late autumn walk, leaves skittering across the path, I understood something else. My grandfather had not been preparing the diary for the world. He had been preparing it for one reader, someone who would listen the way he had lived, someone who would not rush to make meaning louder than it needed to be. I felt humbled by that trust. I felt steadied by it. I began to see the daring escape as the opening chapter of a longer discipline, the discipline of not letting trauma dictate identity. He had escaped a camp, yes, but he had also escaped bitterness, spectacle, and the temptation to define himself by the worst thing that happened to him. He had chosen again and again to be a man who made rooms safer, who folded napkins and fixed hinges and listened. That was the legacy. The diary now sits on my shelf, not hidden, not displayed. It belongs among ordinary things. Sometimes I take it down and read a page at random, letting his voice recalibrate mine. When the world feels insistent, his words remind me that urgency is not always truth. When fear watches, I remember that freedom is deciding to move anyway, quietly, carefully, with respect for the lives entangled with yours. And in that remembering, I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. There was a winter evening when the diary asked something of me more directly than it ever had before. A local school invited me to speak about family history, about memory, and the way ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary events. I almost declined. The idea of standing in front of a room, of condensing my grandfather's life into a presentation, felt like sanding down something sacred until it fit a slide. But then I remembered his insistence on usefulness. Silence was his choice, not a rule for others. Carrying his story did not mean hiding it forever. It meant telling it in a way that did no harm. I agreed on one condition: no photos of camps, no dramatic reenactments, no applause expected. I would speak as he wrote, plainly, carefully, with room for reflection. The night of the talk, I stood under fluorescent lights and felt the old fear watch me, curious to see what I would do. I breathed the way my grandmother used to breathe with him in the night. I began. I told them about a young man who learned to listen to the wind, about patience as a survival skill, about how maps matter, but so do kitchens and barns and rivers you do not argue with. I told them about a choice made in the dark and the many choices that followed it, quieter and harder in their own way. I did not show the diary. I let the words do their work. Afterward, a student stayed behind. He said his grandfather never talked either. He asked if silence meant there was nothing worth sharing. I thought of the folded napkins, the fixed hinges, the hand on a trembling back. Sometimes silence, I said, means there is too much worth protecting. He nodded, not fully understanding yet, but carrying the thought with him. That felt like the right ending. Driving home, I realized how the diary had changed my relationship to time. The war no longer felt like a distant chapter sealed off by dates. It felt present in habits and choices, in the way fear can be met without being obeyed. My grandfather's escape had not ended when he crossed a river. It had echoed forward, shaping a family culture of restraint and care. We had inherited not trauma, but a method for living with it. That winter, my mother fell ill briefly, nothing life-threatening, but enough to bring back the quiet vigil of waiting rooms and late-night coffee. I found myself folding napkins at the hospital cafeteria, aligning the corners without thinking. When she woke, anxious and groggy, I breathed with her the way my grandmother had breathed with him. The chain held. The story lived. I began to notice how often people equated healing with disclosure, as if telling everything were the only path to peace. My grandfather's life argued for another way. Healing could be private, iterative, grounded in behavior rather than confession. He had healed by building a life that contradicted the worst thing done to him. He had answered cruelty with steadiness, chaos with order, fear with gentleness. He had not needed witnesses to validate his recovery. Still, there were moments when I wished I could ask him questions, not about the escape, I felt I knew enough, but about the days that followed, the choices that felt ordinary and were not. Did he ever regret staying quiet? Did he ever feel unseen? The diary did not answer these directly. Instead, it offered a pattern. When faced with a fork, choose the path that leaves others safer. That was his compass. In spring, we found an old photo tucked into a book of hymns. My grandfather, young and unsmiling, standing beside men whose names we did not know. On the back, a date and a place that matched the diary's thinnest entries. I studied his face, looking for signs of the night that had defined him. I found none. I found a man practicing restraint, even in stillness. It felt like confirmation. The more I lived with his story, the more I recognized how rare that kind of courage is. Loud courage wins medals and headlines. Quiet courage keeps families intact, keeps communities humane, keeps the worst from becoming the only thing remembered. My grandfather had chosen the latter without fanfare. He had trusted that decency, repeated daily, would outlast drama. As I prepared to share the story more widely, I returned to his final lines again and again. Let it teach gentleness, not let it impress, not let it shock, let it teach. That was the moral he wanted carried forward. In a world hungry for spectacle, gentleness is a radical act. It resists the flattening of lives into content. It insists on dignity. One evening, near the end of winter, I placed the diary back on the shelf and felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. Not an ending, but a readiness. The story had done its work on me. It had sharpened my attention and softened my reactions. It had taught me to move when fear watched, without making fear the star of the scene. I knew there was still one more piece to tell, a closing that belonged not to the past, but to what we do with it. The diary had brought me to a threshold. What mattered now was how the story would live beyond the page, in choices made quietly, in rooms kept safe, in silences honored for what they protect. That, I understood, would be the final escape, carrying the lesson forward without turning it into noise. I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. The closer I came to the end of the diary, the more I understood why my grandfather had waited so long to write its final lines. The last pages weren't about the war at all. They were about stewardship, about what happens when a story survives longer than the person who lived it. He wrote as if he were speaking to someone specific, someone he trusted to carry weight without dropping it. I felt that trust settle on my shoulders, not heavy, but firm, like a hand steadying you before a long walk. He wrote about age, about the way memory thins in some places and sharpens in others. He admitted without drama that there were nights he still counted steps in his sleep, still listened for sounds that belonged to another decade. But he also wrote that those nights no longer ruled him. Time, he said, does not heal by erasing. It heals by teaching the body what it is safe to release. He had learned to release the need to explain himself. There was a passage where he reflected on being called a hero. He did not reject the word angrily. He examined it, turned it over like a stone. If hero means loud, he wrote, I am not one. If hero means choosing others when fear suggests choosing yourself, then perhaps I have tried. That sentence stayed with me. It reframed everything. His escape had not been about defying death for glory. It had been about preserving humanity in a place designed to strip it away. I realized then how deliberately he had shaped the man we knew. His quiet was not a wound left untreated. It was a discipline practiced daily. He chose jobs that rewarded patience. He chose routines that restored order. He chose relationships that allowed silence to be meaningful instead of awkward. He chose to be dependable. These choices were not accidental. They were how he kept the past from colonizing the present. As I carried his story into conversations in classrooms and small gatherings, I noticed a shift in how people responded. When I resisted sensational details, listeners leaned in rather than pulling away. They filled the space with their own reflections, their own quiet histories. The story became a mirror instead of a performance. That felt right. My grandfather's escape had been collective, after all, dependent on kindnesses that never asked to be named. One afternoon, a woman approached me after a talk and said, I always thought my father's silence meant he didn't trust me. She paused, swallowing. Now I think he was protecting something. We stood there a moment, the room buzzing around us, sharing a recognition that needed no further words. The diary was doing its work beyond my hands. I returned home that night and read the final paragraph again. It was written in a steadier script than the rest, the ink darker, the pressure even. If you are reading this, he wrote, you already know that survival is not the end of the story. Living well is. Choose carefully what you amplify. Protect what deserves protection. remember that the quiet work matters. I closed the diary and felt a calm certainty. The daring escape had given him his life back. The years that followed were his answer to the question of what to do with it. He had answered with care, with humility, with a refusal to let the worst thing define him. In telling his story now, I felt responsible not just to recount events, but to model that same restraint. I thought of my children, of the world they were inheriting, loud, insistent, hungry for instant meaning. I hoped this story would give them another option, that it would teach them to listen longer, to move when fear watched without needing applause, to understand that dignity can be a daily practice. My grandfather had escaped a camp, yes, but his greater escape had been from the temptation to become hardened, from the gravity of bitterness that pulls so many survivors into its orbit. As the season turned and light returned to the evenings, I found myself less eager to add to the noise of the world. I fixed things around the house, I folded napkins, I listened more than I spoke. The story was no longer something I told, it was something I lived. And in that living, I felt closer to him than any archive or document could make me. There was still one last step to take, one final way to honor what he had left behind, not by closing the book, but by opening the future to it. The diary had brought me here, to the edge of understanding. What remained was to speak directly to what his life asked of us now, in a world that rarely pauses to consider the power of quiet courage. I grew up thinking my grandfather was a quiet man with nothing to say about the war. Then I found a leather-bound diary hidden beneath his floorboards. What I read unraveled everything I believed about bravery, silence, and the price of survival. One daring escape, one impossible choice, and a truth he carried alone for 70 years. When I look back now, I understand that the diary didn't just tell me who my grandfather was, it taught me how he wanted to be remembered. Without spectacle, without myth, without turning pain into performance. After finishing the last page, I carried a strange calm with me, the kind that comes when a question you didn't know how to ask has finally been answered. His life no longer felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. It felt like a complete sentence, spoken softly. I began to notice how often the world confuses noise with truth. People argue louder to feel right. They reveal more to feel real. My grandfather had chosen another path. He had lived as proof that meaning does not require an audience. In fact, some meanings survive only when protected from one. That understanding changed how I moved through my days. I spoke less quickly, I listened more carefully, I stopped demanding explanations from people whose silences suddenly felt sacred. One afternoon, while sorting old photographs with my mother, I came across an image of my grandfather holding me as a baby. He is smiling, not the polite smile he gave strangers, but the private one he reserved for moments that felt safe. Looking at that photo after reading the diary, I felt something settle into place. The man who held me had already outrun death once. Everything after that was a choice. He chose tenderness. He chose presence. He chose not to let fear dictate the tone of his life. My mother touched the photograph and said quietly, "I wish he'd told us." I shook my head gently. "I think he did," I said, "just not with words." That was the final lesson the diary gave me. Communication is not always verbal. Some people speak through consistency, through restraint, through the way they show up every day without needing credit. My grandfather had chosen another path. He had lived as proof that meaning does not require an audience. In the months that followed, I stopped thinking of his escape as a single event. I saw it as the beginning of a philosophy. He had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that life could be stripped down to almost nothing and still be worth protecting. From that knowledge, he built a life defined not by what he survived, but by what he refused to become. He refused to become cruel. He refused to become loud. He refused to become consumed by the past. There is a temptation when we uncover stories like his to elevate them into legend, to smooth out the fear, sharpen the bravery, and turn a human being into a symbol. But my grandfather resisted that even in his writing. He documented weakness alongside courage, doubt alongside resolve. He wanted the truth intact, not impressive. That integrity is what stayed with me most. I think now about Elias more often than I expected to, about the man who crossed a river he couldn't swim because staying felt worse than risking everything. About how courage sometimes looks like admitting fear out loud. My grandfather never claimed to save Elias or to be saved by him. He wrote about companionship instead, about how survival can be shared without ownership. That too felt like a quiet rebuke to the way we tell stories, always searching for a single hero when most survival is collective. On the last blank page of the diary, there was nothing written, no farewell, no signature, just space. At first, I thought it was unfinished. Now, I think it was intentional, an invitation maybe, not to add my words to his, but to live in a way that honored them, to let the story continue without being overwritten. So this is where it ends, not with closure, but with continuity. My grandfather's daring escape was real. It was terrifying and improbable and costly, but the greater courage came afterward, in the decades where he chose patience over bitterness, dignity over attention, kindness over control. He escaped the war, then he escaped the trap of letting it define him, and finally he escaped being remembered only for what he endured instead of how he lived. If you take anything from his story, let it be this: you do not owe the world your pain. You do not have to relive your worst moments to prove your strength. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is live gently in a world that rewards harshness. Sometimes silence is not avoidance, but wisdom. Sometimes the quietest lives leave the deepest marks. That